The second panelist is Elena Harkness. Elena is the Program Officer of Community and Economic Development at the MacArthur Foundation in Chicago. Elena has a long history of work with planning, development, and governance in Chicago's diverse communities. She oversees MacArthur's investments in research, policy, and practice that aim to improve conditions in cities around the globe. Please welcome Elena.
Thanks, Allison, and thank you, everyone. This has been a huge privilege for me because it's giving me the opportunity to look at not only the kinds of issues I work on as a professional, but to look at my hometown city and a place where I've spent the majority of my life in a new way. So I just loved seeing that background, and actually my family grew up in one of those historic bungalows in Gage Park, so this is very personal for me, and one of the reasons I love my job. This is going to be a little bit of a different approach, I think. It's less about physical infrastructure. My job deals much more in what I sort of think about as invisible supporting infrastructure that is the background and scaffold for so much of what you've heard about already today. It focuses on the strong organizations and the people and the leadership and how these things tie together. So in the short time I have, I want to give you a little bit of a sense for how MacArthur has tried to invest in this infrastructure in the city of Chicago and what we're thinking about for the future. So to start with a bird's eye view, this is what I think of as the philanthropic vantage point. It's a huge privilege to be able to sit sort of at a place where we get to see across the entire sweep of organizations that are working so hard to make every aspect of quality of life in Chicago better. That's what I get to do. I get to work in the downtown organizations. MacArthur is headquartered here in Chicago, actually in the historic Marquette building, which was finished in 1895, and if you get a chance to see it, it's a gem and a wonderful place to visit. So being headquartered here in the downtown area, I do spend the majority of my time working with organizations headquartered here, but also those that are out in the neighborhoods, and really the neighborhoods are the focus for me in my role. The foundation in general supports organizations across the city because it is our hometown, but one of the wonderful privileges of working in the Community and Economic Development program and focusing so much of our work in the city of Chicago is, as you heard from Bob and others, this is really the birthplace of so much of the research that understood and described what the city is and the city's challenges are. It's the birthplace of the settlement movement, community organizing. So many of the foundational institutional forms that support strong and healthy neighborhoods were really homegrown right here in Chicago, and we've been able to witness that evolution. So it is a wonderful vantage point. So here's one way to look at Chicago as a city of neighborhoods. Sort of the black and white picture where every neighborhood sort of stands alone as a box and they're all created equal and they all are part of this grid and a wonderful fabric. To the right, you see the sort of mosaic picture where it's just a rainbow and everything is sort of distributed and colorful and wonderful. And I think what we know is the story is actually quite different. As Bob said, it's a story of constant change on the one hand, but it's also a story of persistent stability and patterns of concentrated disadvantage. And so here, this is a map from 2010. It looks much the same today of the change in per capita income and where the winners and losers actually are, the greatest gainers. Here's a map of gun violence in Chicago. So you see the south and west sides and the disproportionate burden that they are bearing from gun violence, from economic disadvantage. The economic hardship index, you see the south and west side concentration, again, of neighborhoods that are bearing a disproportionate burden from the recession. Again, in red, these are the foreclosed homes and vacant properties that are distressed. So for us at MacArthur and for those in the city working on this issue, the question becomes, how do we support and seek to address these persistent patterns of disadvantage, of inequality, and of disproportionate burden on those that we seek to support? And so the story, there's a flip side. I first want to say I don't have slides here and maps to show it, but there's clearly a flip side that shows the assets that these neighborhoods have. We tend to see these maps that show the problems, but there is certainly a flip side that shows tremendous concentration of resources, entrepreneurship, arts and culture organizations, and thriving civic life. And that is the fabric that we often seek to support. But when we think about how to address this issue, one of the ways we think about it, of really tackling it, is creating stronger and deeper connections. So connecting these neighborhoods that are often described as segregated or isolated, how do we connect them back to the thriving core of Chicago, the hub of the economy, all of the resources, the jobs, the transit? And one of the answers that we often hear is infrastructure. So it's roads, it's housing, it's the built environment, it's things that all of you out there know much more about than I do. And it's certainly the water, and it's maximizing all of these resources and figuring out how we get people to them. But underneath all of this built environment infrastructure is a different kind of infrastructure. This is a social network map. So this just shows a cluster of related individuals and organizations. And this is really important to me because as we try to understand how to develop better solutions to address these issues, one of the things we need to understand is how to do community development work better and how we strengthen these connections and make these resources better distributed across the range of people in Chicago. In a network map and in network theory, which is sort of coming into its own in a new way because of lots of new data that's available all the time, cheaper data acquisition, cheaper and faster data analysis. So this helps us understand how people are connecting to each other in points in time, how organizations play more or less important roles in the distribution of resources in a city. And network theorists have it's a kind of concept called network centrality. And so the organization's role in this network, where you sit, how many organizations are connected to you, has something to do with how powerful you are. And so one of the ways we look at building and investing in organizations in the city is to try to understand which ones are already connected to individuals in disconnected communities, which ones are bridging the strongest connections to resources that tend to be concentrated in the downtown or in the hands of very few or in financial institutions. Who are the people who are bridging those gaps? Can we identify who they are, invest in them, and help them to do that work better? So in this slide, I will try to consolidate 50 years of community development and corporation history. But the basic story in Chicago and elsewhere is that the Community Reinvestment Act unleashed a wave of community development that was focused on the built environment. And it was really focused on how we address better housing conditions and use that as a sort of springboard for quality of life issues. And so for many years, community development corporations were a new institutional form that came up to have the resources to connect neighborhoods to the bigger inflow of community reinvestment dollars that were needed to build these houses. And what we learned from many decades of that sort of real estate, built environment-driven investment was that it seemed to be missing quite a few of the other things that made neighborhoods strong and great, and some of the challenges that were really pressing: violence, education, health, parks, quite a few of the things we've heard about today. And so in the 90s, again, this was actually an institutional innovation that was anchored here in Chicago, a key institution called the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC Chicago, which is one of these big community development corporations. They began to ask how could they think about building and investing in a way that wasn't so real estate centered, that certainly acknowledged the importance of the built environment and the importance of housing, but actually broadened the view to be anchored more in this, I love this description of ecological urbanism that we talked about earlier, because it was really about thinking about the neighborhood as an ecology, as a place, and developing full quality of life plans that accounted for every single facet of life in that neighborhood and developing a systematic plan for moving it forward. And so this planning process developed over, I guess I would call it 15 years actually. And the MacArthur Foundation played an important role as a long-term investor. I think often in philanthropy, there's a tendency to sort of look for the next big thing, look for the next new promising innovation. And I think what really was great about MacArthur's vision, and I can say this, I wasn't there at the time, this was started under predecessors, and I'm just grateful it continued, was that there was a view that this was going to be an institution building project that would take a long time. So this forward-looking investment of more than $150 million in this one key institution that was very central in this network of organizations in the city, in LISC Chicago, and then all of the neighborhood organizations that sit in these South and West Side communities largely, where all of these challenges needed to be addressed. That really led to some very promising improvements over time. So not only new housing built and new resources driven to neighborhoods, millions of dollars of new investment, but truly community-generated plans for neighborhood parks, for better community schools, for healthcare clinics that were co-located in school environments where parents could easily access them. A whole range of plans, and this really strong connection between bottom-up community planning and the sort of top-down city-driven plans, which they have to meet in the middle in order to be successful. That is definitely my view from all of this. So where we are today, the LISC Chicago network has moved from what started as a pilot in the 90s to more than 17 neighborhoods that are benefiting from comprehensive quality of life planning. I will show you, here's the map right now that shows, so not only in those south and west side neighborhoods where I showed you the sort of concentrated patterns of challenges, but in other neighborhoods in the city as well. So you can look at LISC's website for a wonderful, sort of very journalistic look at all of the different things that they are accomplishing in these neighborhoods with support now from a broad range of a very diverse range of funders. But I want to just bring back to this key insight that this was an institutional innovation. It was a different way of thinking about the project of neighborhood building. And it was with a kind of institution that had a legacy of doing things one way, really thinking about real estate investment, and a slow but very important shift to thinking about this broader ecological model of community-based planning and connecting to outside the neighborhood. So at MacArthur now, we continue to invest in not only this core program, but many of the things that it has spun out. And we're also looking at what kinds of new institutional innovations need to happen to make Chicago stronger. One of the projects that I'm particularly sort of proud of and encouraging of is called the Smart Chicago Collaborative. This is a completely, it's related to the neighborhood development work, but it's a brand new fund that is housed at our community foundation here in Chicago. And its purpose is to fill what had been a sort of leadership gap around information technology and leveraging all of the power of technology-driven innovation related to community needs. And so this was a bridge builder, a connector, a really important node organization that needed to be created to bridge some of the really exciting talent that is burgeoning in Chicago's information technology economy, but connect it to the very deep legacy of organizations in neighborhoods that understand how to frame community problems and how best to sort of articulate, these are the solutions we need, how do we connect and figure out how to leverage data and information technology to do it better. And that's really Smart Chicago's job, is to be a convener, to gather people together, to think about how to help accelerate these plans and move them forward. So I'm going to stop there. If you have questions, I encourage you to connect, learn more with us. We are constantly investing in research, as well as trying to bridge the gap between research, policy, and practice that we so often. So thank you so much. Looking forward to talking with the rest of you.